All right, diving right in today. Moral sentimentalism.
Sounds heavy.
It kind of is, but also kind of fascinating. The basic idea is that our emotions, how we feel, they're not just sidekicks in the moral story, they're the main characters. Like, whether we think something is right or wrong.
It really comes down to our gut feeling.
Yeah, more or less. Sentimentalism says that connection is way deeper than we usually think.
And I bet a lot of our listeners are thinking, my gut is right.
Probably. But hey, that's why we're taking a deep dive here to figure out if that's actually true. And can I just say, listeners, you guys are the best. Always hungry for knowledge, but you want it served up right.
Thorough but tasty.
Exactly. So no dry philosophy lectures today. We're going full-on conversational, figuring out this whole moral sentimentalism thing together. But gotta lay some groundwork first.
Foundation before the fancy stuff.
Right. So sentimentalism, it's not just one big idea. It's kind of like 4 branches on this philosophical tree. First up, we've got explanatory sentimentalism, which asks why we even have moral thoughts in the first place. Then there's judgment sentimentalism, which is all about what those moral thoughts actually are.
So origins and content.
Perfect. Then we get into the really deep stuff. Metaphysical sentimentalism. That's about the nature of moral facts themselves. Do they exist? What are they like? And lastly, epistemic sentimentalism. That tackles how we can actually know right from wrong.
Like, do we reason it out? Or is it more instinctive?
Ooh, good question. We'll get there. But before we go abstract, let's ground ourselves with a story. Franz de Waal tells this great one about a handyman in France, this guy named Jay, super nice guy, helps his neighbor install a skylight. No charge, free labor, whole day's work.
Sounds like a good neighbor.
You'd think, right? Well, a few days later, neighbor mentions he's going scuba diving. Jay, thinking maybe he'll get a little something back for his generosity, says he's interested. Mentions he's a bit short on cash, though. Yeah, neighbor ends up going diving alone.
So much for returning the favor.
Right. Now, think about your reaction to that. Did you kind of feel a little negative towards the neighbor?
I think most people would.
Yeah.
Seems a bit unfair.
Exactly. And probably, without even thinking too hard, you judged the neighbor's actions as wrong.
Well, explanatory sentimentalism says those two things, the feeling and the judgment, they're not just coincidentally happening together.
They're linked. The feeling is actually what's driving the judgment.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that. Why do we have moral thoughts at all? This branch of sentimentalism says it all boils down to our feelings, our emotions. And where did this whole idea come from?
Well, you got to go back a couple of centuries. 18th century Britain, lots of philosophical debate happening. One big name was the Earl of Shaftesbury. He brought up this idea of a moral sense.
More sense.
Yeah. Shaftesbury was all about second-order affections, meaning it's not just about feeling kindness or cruelty, it's about having feelings about those feelings. So, like, approving of your own kindness, disapproving of your own cruelty. Meta feelings.
Exactly. And he thought, this is where moral approval comes from. This second-order liking of our good-natured affections. It's like we've got this built-in sense of right and wrong.
So morality isn't just, I did a good thing, it's, I feel good about feeling good.
Exactly. And this idea got picked up by Francis Hutcheson. He really ran with this moral sense thing. He thought of it as this spontaneous thing in our minds. We don't have to think about it. It just pops up.
Like an instinct, almost.
Yeah, like when you see someone being kind, you automatically approve. It's not calculated. It's just this innate moral sense saying, yep, that's good. And he specifically thought this sense is tuned towards the general calm desire of the happiness of others.
So we're naturally wired to like it when people are trying to make others happy.
Basically. And he believed this desire for others' happiness, that's what motivates good actions. Yeah. And our moral sense, that's what lets us recognize those actions as good. Now, fast forward to more recent times, we've got Jonathan Haidt, and he's really brought back this explanatory sentimentalism in big way.
I've heard of Haidt. He's all about the intuitions, right?
Yeah. He's got this dual process model. Says there's type 1 processes, which are all about gut reactions, fast, automatic, emotional. And then type 2, which is slower, more thoughtful, deliberate. And his big claim is that when it comes to morality, we're mostly running on type 1.
So those snap judgments, those are actually driving most of our moral beliefs.
That's what he thinks.
Ah.
And he's got some interesting evidence. Like there are these studies where they mess with people's emotions, and it actually changes their moral judgment.
Like make them angry and they'll judge harsher?
Exactly. Plus, there's brain imaging stuff that shows the emotional centers lighting up when people are making moral decisions. And then there's this moral dumbfounding thing.
Dumbfoundry.
Yeah, like when people have these strong moral opinions, but they can't really explain why. Like they just know something is wrong, even if they don't have a logical reason. Haidt says this shows that a lot of the time we're rationalizing our feelings after the fact.
So reason is like the PR guy for our emotions?
Exactly. And this guy, Joshua Green, he's done some similar stuff, looking at deontological versus utilitarian judgments. Like, deontological is all about rules and duties, and utilitarian is about the greater good. He thinks the deontological judgments, those are more emotionally driven, while utilitarian ones involve more reasoning.
But then, doesn't that mean some moral judgments are more reasoned?
Well, Guy Kahane, he argues it's not necessarily about the type of judgment, but about whether it feels intuitive. Like, our gut might say one thing, but if we really think about it, we might come to a different conclusion.
Ah, so it's about whether we have to go against our initial feeling. That makes sense. But where do all these pre-programmed emotional responses come from?
Well, Haidt, he's got an evolutionary explanation. He thinks these feelings, like compassion, contempt, anger, disgust, they developed over time because they helped our ancestors survive and get along. Like feeling compassion towards someone who's hurt, that might lead you to help them, and then they might help you later.
So it's all about cooperation and survival.
Exactly. But there's this issue with Haidt's view, which is that he doesn't really distinguish between moral and non-moral disapproval. Like, I dislike Brussels sprouts, but that doesn't mean I think they're morally wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Daniel Jacobson, he really hits on this. He says, just because someone can't immediately give you a reason for their moral judgment doesn't mean they don't have one. Maybe they just haven't articulated it yet.
So the post hoc reasoning, it could be genuine, not just a cover-up.
Exactly. And then there's Joshua May. He's got some empirical challenges to Haidt. Thinks emotions play a smaller role, more like helping us process information than dictating our judgments.
So more of a supporting role than a leading one.
Right. His research shows that just randomly feeling an emotion doesn't really change moral judgments that much. And he says the moral judgments of people with emotional deficits, like psychopaths, they're not explained by a lack of feelings, but by problems with reasoning. Plus, he found that things like intention matter a lot for moral judgments, which suggests thinking is involved.
So it's not just, I feel bad, therefore it's wrong. We're taking other factors into account.
Right. But even with those challenges, explanatory sentimentalism can still say, look, we condemn things that make us feel bad, right? And even if our reason figures out all the facts, it's the emotion that adds that moral punch. Like Hume said, reason paves the way, but sentiment is what gets us moving.
So emotions are the fuel, even if reason steers the car. Now, there's another big part of explanatory sentimentalism. It's all about sympathy and empathy. And here's where Hume and Adam Smith really come in.
Yeah, and when they talked about sympathy, it was more like what we now call empathy, really getting into another person's shoes, feeling what they feel.
Not just feeling bad for them, but feeling bad with them.
Exactly. And they thought this empathy thing, this was way more fundamental to morality than some innate moral sense.
And Hume was pretty clear that reason alone can't make the moral call.
Oh, yeah. He was like, reason can't tell us what our goals should be, and it can't get us to act on them either. So where does morality come from?
All right, spill the beans, Hume.
Well, he thought moral approval, it's basically a special kind of pleasure we get when we look at someone's character impartially, like a feeling of love towards traits that benefit others. And this feeling, it comes from empathy. We see someone being kind, we see the other person happy, and we feel that happiness too, vicariously.
So it's like emotional contagion. Their good vibes rub off on us.
Exactly. Sophie de Grouchy, she even talked about how memory plays a role. Like remembering times when we felt something similar, it helps us feel compassion. So for Hume, we approve of virtues because they made people happy, and we get a little taste of that happiness ourselves through empathy.
But it can't be as simple as whatever makes me feel good is good. What about when we approve of things that don't directly benefit us?
Right, like strangers. We don't necessarily feel warm and fuzzy towards every stranger, but we can still approve of their good deeds.
And we're not always super nice to people we do feel close to. Family can be complicated.
True. Well, Hume recognized this. He said we correct our initial feelings. Not like trying to find some objective truth, but more like adjusting our sentiments so they fit with what everyone else expects.
So it's like a social calibration.
Yeah. Like when we use moral language, we expect other people to understand us, to share our sentiment. So we have to think about how those character traits affect society as a whole, not just our own little circle.
So we're not just reacting, we're thinking about the bigger picture. Now, Adam Smith, he had a slightly different take on sympathy.
Right. For Smith, it was more about actively imagining yourself in someone else's shoes, not just passively feeling what they feel, but really putting yourself there.
Like a mental simulation.
Exactly. He called it simulation. He thought this is where moral approval comes from. When our imagined feelings match what we think the other person is actually feeling, it gives us this sense of propriety.
So it's about getting on the same emotional wavelength.
And interestingly, Smith thought this happened in all kinds of evaluation, not just moral stuff. But for him, when you're judging something morally, you're not just imagining yourself in the actor's shoes, you're also imagining yourself as the person affected by the action.
So it's like multi-perspective empathy.
And you're doing all this from the point of view of an impartial spectator, like this imagined wise person who's observing the whole situation.
So our inner critic is actually a super empathetic one.
In a way, yeah. And then you've got more contemporary thinkers like Michael Sloat, who really focused on empathy.
I like Sloat. He seems like a warm and fuzzy guy.
He is. And his theory is kind of warm and fuzzy, too. He says moral approval, it's basically just empathizing with someone's motives.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they're acting out of genuine care for others, we feel that care too, and that feeling is our moral approval.
So it's like a resonance of good intentions.
Exactly. But even some sentimentalists are like, hold on, it can't be that simple.
What are the objections?
Well, Jesse Prince, he points out that Sloat's theory doesn't really explain moral disapproval. Like, just not feeling empathy for someone's motives isn't the same as thinking they're bad. And Julia Driver, she says people with empathy deficits can still make moral judgments. Plus, sometimes we approve of things done out of duty, not empathy. Or we disapprove of things done with good intentions, but bad outcomes.
So it's more complicated than just empathy good, no empathy bad.
Right. And then there's Sean Nichols. He's got this interesting theory about affect-backed rules. He says we've got this general ability to follow rules, and then we've got these pre-existing emotional responses to certain things, like harm. And we consider a rule violation morally wrong if the rule is about something we already have a negative reaction to.
So it's like the rule taps into our existing emotional wiring.
Exactly. And he uses psychopaths as an example. They often have trouble distinguishing moral rules from just social conventions.
Because they don't have that emotional response.
Right. So for Nichols, that emotional backing, that's what makes a rule moral. And he also thinks this explains why some moral norms are so universal. If a rule aligns with our basic emotional dispositions, it's more likely to stick around across different cultures.
So morality is like a cultural evolution of our feelings.
In a way, yeah. So all these different explanatory sentimentalism theories, they're trying to show how our moral intuitions come from our emotions and where those emotions come from.
Yeah.
Whether it's evolution or social stuff or empathy.
Makes sense. But now let's shift gears a bit. What about the moral judgments themselves? What are they made of? That's where judgment sentimentalism comes in.
Right. Judgment sentimentalism is all about what's going on in our heads when we're making moral calls. Are we thinking about feelings? Are our moral words expressing feelings?
So more about the content of our moral thoughts.
Exactly. And one big category here is non-cognitivist sentimentalism. They say our moral thoughts are not actually beliefs, they are sentiments.
So thinking X is wrong is basically just having a negative feeling towards X.
Yep. And one of their big arguments is the argument from internalism. It basically says moral judgments, they inherently motivate us to act.
Like, if you think something is morally required, you'll at least be a little bit inclined to do it.
Right. Moral judgments are supposed to guide our actions. But then there's this Humean theory of motivation, which says beliefs on their own can't do that. We need some kind of desire or feeling to get us moving.
So if moral judgments make us act and beliefs don't, then moral judgments can't just be beliefs. They got to have some feeling in them.
Exactly. And some contemporary non-cognitivists, they talk about higher order attitudes towards desires. Like morally disapproving of something isn't just disliking it, it's also approving of people who dislike it and disapproving of those who don't.
So it's like a social endorsement of the feeling.
Right. And then there's Alan Gibbard. He connects moral judgments to judgments about guilt and resentment. Like, to think stealing is wrong is to think it's rational to feel guilty if you steal and resentful if someone else does.
So it's about whether those emotions are appropriate?
Exactly. Then there's expressivism, which is like the language version of non-cognitivism. They focus on moral words and sentences.
So how we talk about morality.
Exactly. Expressivists say the meaning of a moral sentence isn't about whether it's true or false, but about the feeling it expresses. Like, when I say murder is wrong, I'm not stating a fact about murder, I'm expressing my disapproval.
Like saying boo to a bad movie.
Exactly. But this raises some tricky questions about how we reason with moral language. If moral sentences don't have truth values, how do we figure out which ones are right?
Good point.
But most contemporary expressivists, they're not saying we can't talk about moral truth. They just see it as another way of expressing our commitments.
So it's more about emphasizing our stance than describing reality.
Right. Now, on the other side, we've got cognitivist sentimentalism. They say moral judgments are beliefs, but they're beliefs about sentiments.
So it's not just feeling it, it's thinking about the feeling.
Right. And the simplest version is speaker subjectivism. Like, stealing is wrong just means I disapprove of stealing. Hume kind of toyed with this idea. And then there's metaethical contextualism, which says the standard of approval can change depending on who's talking and what they're talking about.
But doesn't simple subjectivism make disagreements impossible?
That's the missing disagreement problem. Like, if I say eating people is wrong and a cannibal says no, it's not, we're both technically right on that view. It's just a report of our feelings.
So it's not a real debate about morality, just a difference in taste.
Exactly. Contemporary subjectivists try to fix this by focusing on disagreement in attitude. Like, even if our statements aren't contradicting, our underlying feelings are clashing.
So it's a disagreement about what we should feel.
Right. But another issue with speaker subjectivism is that it makes moral judgments seem kind of shallow. Like, if someone thinks stealing is wrong just because their religion says so, it's not really a moral judgment, it's just a belief about their religion.
But some people think that's a good thing. It makes morality more grounded in what people actually believe.
True. Now, ideal dispositionalist views, they try to avoid these problems by bringing in the idea of an ideal observer.
Someone who's perfectly rational and impartial.
Exactly. They say moral properties, they're not based on just anyone's feelings, but on the feelings a perfectly informed and impartial observer would have. It's kind of like Hume's common point of view and Smith's impartial spectator, but amped up.
So it's like the ultimate moral compass.
Right. And this helps with the disagreement problem because people can have different beliefs about what the ideal observer would feel.
But then why should I care what some imaginary perfect being thinks?
That's the missing motivation problem. If morality is just about what the ideal observer would approve of, why should that motivate me to do anything?
Good question.
Some rationalists say it's irrational to not be motivated by what your ideal self would do.
Yeah.
But a sentimentalist might say, we have this deep desire to align our feelings with those of an ideal perspective.
Like we want to live up to that standard.
Exactly. Then there's sensibility theory and neo-sentimentalism. They focus on the idea of merited responses.
What does that mean?
Well, they compare it to secondary qualities like color. Colors are real properties, but how they look to us depends on our eyes. Values are kind of similar. They're real, but how they appear to us depends on our emotional sensibilities.
So it's like we can't perceive value without feeling it.
Exactly. And John McDowell, he says a virtuous person, they can just see the moral reasons for acting. They don't need a separate desire. The perception itself motivates them.
Like their moral compass is just super finely tuned.
Right. And neo-sentimentalism, it defines evaluative concepts in terms of appropriate emotional responses. Like saying something is shameful means shame is the fitting response.
So moral judgments are about guiding our emotions.
Exactly. And then there are these hybrid approaches that try to combine the cognitive and non-cognitive stuff.
So maybe it's not all one or the other.
Right. Some say moral judgments involve both feelings and beliefs. Others say it's all about different kinds of psychological states.
So lots of different flavors of judgment sentimentalism. But now, let's get really metaphysical. What about the nature of moral facts themselves? That's where metaphysical sentimentalism comes in.
Right. Metaphysical sentimentalism says moral facts, they're not just out there in the world, independent of us. They're tied to our human sensibility.
So no objective morality, it's all relative.
Well, not necessarily. But they definitely think the idea of these mind-independent moral facts is problematic. And they don't think just pointing to some natural fact is enough either. Like, just because something causes pain doesn't automatically make it wrong.
So where do the moral facts come from?
Well, non-cognitivists, they basically say moral facts are projections of our attitudes. Like, we're not really describing something out there, we're expressing our commitments.
It's more about us than the world.
Right. But cognitivists, they think moral judgments actually refer to real facts, but those facts are determined by our emotional responses.
So our feelings make things right or wrong.
In a way, yeah. And this leads to subjectivism and relativism. Like, what's wrong is what people disapprove of. But then you run into problems. Like, what if nobody knows about a bad act? Does that mean it's not wrong?
So the undetected murder gets off scot-free.
Exactly. Some try to fix this by saying it's about whether someone would disapprove if they knew. But then there's this problem of rigidity. Like, if we all started approving of slavery, would it become okay?
That doesn't sound right.
Yeah. And there's the problem of fallibility, too. If morality is just based on what we happen to approve of, how can we ever be wrong?
So, like, if I think kicking puppies is good, is it suddenly morally acceptable?
Well, ideal dispositionalism tries to avoid these issues by saying moral facts are grounded in the sentiments of an ideal observer, someone who's perfectly rational and impartial.
So it's not about our flawed feelings, it's about the feelings of this perfect being.
Exactly. And this allows for fallibility, because we can be wrong about what the ideal observer would feel. And it can solve the rigidity problem, too, because a perfectly impartial observer wouldn't approve of something inherently harmful.
But then what makes this ideal observer so special? Who decides what they'd feel?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for ideal dispositionalism. It's like, are things good because the ideal observer approves, or does the ideal observer approve because they're good? And why should we care what this hypothetical being thinks anyway?
And would all ideal observers agree? It seems like even perfect beings could have different opinions.
Right. Plus, why do we even need this idealization in the first place? Can't we just talk about regular people's feelings?
So lots of puzzles there.
Yeah.
What about sensibility theory and neo-sentimentalism? What do they say about moral facts?
They say an evaluative property is just the property of meriting a certain response. Like, something is good if it's fitting to feel admiration towards it.
But isn't that circular? Like, it's good if it's good to feel good about it.
Well, they say it's not circular because the feeling and the property are kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're intertwined.
So it's not like one causes the other, they just go together.
Exactly. And then there's this fitting attitudes analysis, which says something is valuable if and only if a certain response to it is fitting. But sentimentalists who use this analysis have to be careful because they have to make sure the fittingness of the feeling is tied to the actual value of the thing, not just some random reason.
So, like, if I feel good about something because I'm drugged, that doesn't make it good.
Exactly. So metaphysical sentimentalism is all about this idea that maybe moral reality isn't totally separate from us. It's somehow shaped by our emotional responses.
Makes you think, huh?
Yeah.
But now for the grand finale. Epistemic sentimentalism. How do we actually know right from wrong?
Yeah, this one's a bit mind-blowing. They say our emotions, those gut feelings, they can actually give us moral knowledge.
Really? But aren't emotions supposed to be irrational and biased?
That's what a lot of people think. Even historically, philosophers have been pretty suspicious of emotions when it comes to knowledge. Like Plato thought they messed with reason, and the Stoics thought they were based on bad judgments.
So epistemic sentimentalists have a tough case to make.
They do. One approach is to compare moral knowledge to sensory perception. Like we just feel that something is wrong in the same way we see that the sky is blue.
So it's direct knowledge, no reasoning required.
Exactly. And there's research showing that our emotional responses often come before our conscious moral judgments. So the question is, can these emotional responses be a kind of moral perception?
Like a sixth sense for morality.
Right. Hume famously said passions don't represent anything. But a lot of contemporary sentimentalists disagree. They say emotions are about something, they have content, so they can potentially give us reasons. Some even think moral emotions are actually a kind of judgment built into the feeling itself.
So the feeling already has the judgment baked in.
Exactly. Another view is that emotions are like perception in that they're spontaneous and give us information without us having to think about it. So they can be these moral intuitions popping up in our minds.
So like a feeling of disgust towards a cruel act, that could be a moral intuition.
Exactly. And this leads to epistemic emotional perceptualism, or EEP for short. It says emotions give us immediate justification for moral beliefs. Like if you feel disgusted by something, that's a reason to believe it's wrong.
But isn't that just trusting your gut blindly?
Well, EEP proponents say it's not blind. They say our emotions are based on real features of the world. And they say even if the emotion itself isn't a belief, it can still be justified by the beliefs and perceptions it's based on.
So it's like the feeling highlights the morally relevant stuff.
Exactly. But there are still challenges. Like we usually ask for reasons when someone's emotional, but not when they're just perceiving something. And then there's the self-justification problem. Can my fear alone justify my belief that something's dangerous?
Like, maybe I'm just afraid of spiders, but they're actually harmless.
Right. But sentimentalists might say that, in normal cases, emotions do reliably present things as having certain qualities. Like fear presents something as dangerous. And they might say that even though our desires can influence our emotions, that doesn't mean emotions can't give us knowledge.
So it's about finding the right balance between feelings and reason.
Exactly. But then there's the big question. Are emotions connected to the world in the same way our senses are?
Like, do they track real moral properties?
Right. Some sentimentalists say emotions represent moral properties through how they feel, not just through how they're caused. And when it comes to reliability, they might say our emotions are more reliable when they're coming from a place of competence, or that there's just this built-in link between moral facts and emotional responses.
So our feelings are attuned to morality.
In a way, yeah. But then there's this calibration problem. Like, how do we know if our moral sense is accurate in the first place?
If it's just based on feelings, how do we avoid being totally subjective?
Well, some say we can check our moral sense by looking at the circumstances, like are we calm and informed? Others say we need to take the perspective of an impartial observer. And some think our moral intuitions can actually track moral facts through experience, kind of like how we learn to see things correctly.
So we can train our moral sense.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But then there's the question of moral understanding and testimony. Like, why is it so hard to just take someone's word for it on moral matters?
Yeah, it's different from just learning a fact.
Right. Some sentimentalists say it's because moral understanding involves more than just knowing facts. It involves developing the right emotional and motivational responses.
So it's not just about what you think, it's about how you feel.
Exactly. And some say emotions actually motivate us to figure out why things are right or wrong, which deepens our understanding.
So it's all connected. Wow, this has been a whirlwind tour of sentimentalism.
It's a rich area, that's for sure.
And for our listeners who are always up for a challenge, I think we've given them plenty to chew on.
Definitely. So as you go about your day, think about those times you feel a strong moral conviction. How is that feeling shaping your understanding of right and wrong? And does examining your emotions change your perspective at all?
Food for thought, everyone. And that's a wrap on another deep dive.